Okay, so in this Nearpod lesson, we are going to be covering motor control, but we're going to be looking specifically at motor control pathways from the brain to the spinal cord. So we'll be looking at the pathways, we'll be looking at pathways to the spinal cord, we'll be looking also at the neural control of muscles. So during our live class, we'll be looking at cortical areas involved in motor control and subcortical areas. And for this Nearpod lesson, we'll be looking more at the pathways that run down the spine and out to the muscles. Okay, so let's get started with what types of movements we have. So we've got many types of movements that we can make, of course, but they're really kind of can be grouped into two broad categories. Movements that require the brain and movements that do not. So movements that do not require the brain are called reflexes. So these are simple, unvarying responses. They don't have to be learned. And they're responses to sensory stimuli such as touch, pressure, or pain. So reflexes don't have to be learned and don't require the brain. And then the larger category of movements that we have are motor plans or motor programs. So these are going to be our more complex types of voluntary movements that are comprised of sets of muscle commands that are planned or established before the action occurs. So we've got reflexes, we've got motor plans, we've got reflexes being movements that don't require the brain, and movement plans or movement programs, voluntary movements that do require the brain. So how do we know, one group of movements require the brain and one don't? So how do we know that reflexes do not require the brain? There's a couple of different types of evidence. We've got evidence from research with animals that have had their spine severed at different points. So these are called spinal animals. So spinal animals that have had their spine severed at different points are still able to perform reflexive behaviors. So one other example, spinal cord injuries in humans. So your textbook illustrates the case of Christopher Reeve, an actor, the actor who played Superman. So Christopher Reeve had his spinal cord injury where the spine, his spine was severed just below the brain in a horseback riding accident. So this spinal cord injury left Christopher Reeve unable to move or even breathe without the aid of a respirator. So he was unable to move voluntarily, basically from the neck down. So he, with the particular type of spinal cord injury that he had, his brain had no way to communicate with the spinal neurons that we'll be talking about in a little bit. But because the spinal cord, in many of these spinal cord injuries, in Christopher Reeve's case in particular, the spinal cord was still intact. It just wasn't able to communicate with the brain. So this would mean that the spinal cord would be still able to mediate many reflexes, such as, limb withdrawal, to a noxious stimulus, or other types of reflexes. And also, like with spinal animals that have had their spinal cord severed at different points of the spinal cord for research purposes, they're even able to, produce stepping responses and walking responses if their weight is supported. So for example, if a spinal animal is suspended in a hammock and placed on, in such a way that their limbs are in light contact with a moving treadmill, but their body is supported, their legs will begin to make stepping movements automatically. So this tells us, that some behavior, reflexive behavior, can be generated through the spinal cord, not necessarily the brain. So reflexive behaviors that don't require the brain, and then we have voluntary movements that do. So motor control is best understood as being a hierarchy. So the motor system is often described as being organized in a hierarchy, and this means that there are lower levels and higher levels of movement control. So this hierarchy spans the spinal cord, subcortical regions, and we've got the cortex at the top. But at the bottom, we have the lowest levels, which are the muscles in the body, muscles in the face, neck, and head. So these are the ones that the parts at the lowest levels of the system, the motor control system: skeletal muscles, muscles in the body, muscles in the face, head, and neck. So the spinal mechanisms, spinal cord, they are the point of contact between the nervous system and the muscles. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, they're also capable of producing simple reflexive movements. So the top of hierarchy, this hierarchy, we've got primary motor cortex. We've also got 9 primary motor regions. So these are the ones we're going to be looking at during the live class: primary motor regions and non-primary motor regions, as well as subcortical regions. So these ones are at the top of the hierarchy, and processing within these regions at the higher levels of the hierarchy, cortical regions, these regions are critical for planning and action based on your current goals, based on sensory input, based on your past experience. So these higher level types of motor control. So the muscles in the body, the head, the face, the neck, they are attached to the skeletal system. And the way that our bones are attached to each other allows for certain movements and not others. So our skeletal system is it's limited. So a lot of our movements are limited by the structure of our skeletal system. So if we look at this, giving just a brief overview of the mobility of some of our joints, so some of our joints have more mobility than others. So if you think about the type of mobility that you have in your wrist or in your hips, this is kind of similar to, like if you look at the hips, it's kind of similar to a ball and a socket joint, right? We've got quite a bit of range of movement, both kind of laterally and rotational. And the same with the wrist, quite a bit more movement in the wrist compared to the hips, but both the wrists and hips, they have a very wide range of mobility compared to something like our elbows and our knees. So our elbows and knees, you can think of them as being like hinges on a door, right? They really only move in one direction, right? They really only move back and forth, and that's it. So skeletal muscle contraction, this is initiated by motor neurons that are located in the spinal cord and the brainstem. So skeletal muscle contraction is initiated by lower motor neurons. So these are ones that are located in the spinal cord and brainstem. So we've got lower motor neurons located in the spinal cord and brainstem, and we've also got upper motor neurons that are located, in the brain, higher regions of the brain. So the lower motor neurons and upper motor neurons, really just a term to indicate where they are located relative to the brain. So lower motor neurons are located in the spine and the brainstem. Upper motor neurons are located above the brainstem. So the brainstem, this is an important region for a variety of functions, vital functions, but when we're talking about motor control, the brainstem is important for integrating motor commands and relaying sensory information. And up higher in these cortical regions, so these are the ones we're going to talk about a lot more in a lot more detail during the live class. But for now, we'll just say primary cortex, primary motor cortex. This is an important region for initiating movements, initiating those commands that are going to move the muscles. Non-primary regions are important for planning movements as well. So premotor cortex, parietal cortex, all of those non-primary regions are important for planning movements as well. The primary motor cortex, that is involved in actually initiating the signals that will move the muscles in the body. So subcortical regions are important as well. We'll talk a little bit about these during the live class. So subcortical regions, they are massive, complex circuits in and of themselves, and they have output pathways that don't, basically they have output pathways that don't have direct access to either lower, that don't have access to those lower motor neurons. So subcortical regions, they influence movement indirectly by influencing the activity of upper and lower motor neurons in an indirect fashion. So they regulate the activity of upper and lower motor neurons. So they have a regulatory role through kind of indirect routes, which we'll talk more about these subcortical regions in class. So let's look at some of our pathways for motor control. So those running from to and from the brain and the spine. So the corticospinal tract, this is a pathway that carries information from the motor cortex to the spinal cord. So the neurons in the corticospinal tract, they are upper motor neurons. So again, this just means that upper motor neurons, they are neurons that extend from the cerebral cortex or the brainstem and synapse with the lower motor neurons that are usually located in the spinal cord. So upper motor neurons, they control the activity of lower motor neurons, which control the activity of muscles to produce movement. So upper motor neurons control the lower motor neurons, and lower motor neurons actually control the muscles. So I believe I just said this. So upper motor neurons, they connect with the lower motor neurons, and then the lower motor neurons, they extend from the spinal cord down to the muscles. So many upper motor neurons have their cell bodies located in the motor cortex itself, and they send their axons down through the brainstem. So these are all of the different layers or regions of the brainstem. These are all the different layers, regions of the brainstem. These axons, they travel through these layers and on to descending to the spinal cord. But before they reach the spinal cord, the axons cross over. So the upper motor neurons, before they leave the spinal cord, they cross over at the medulla. So this is why the left side of the brain is said to control the right side of the body and vice versa. It's because of this crossover point here at the medulla. So lower motor neurons, they're located in the spinal cord and they project down to the skeletal muscles in the body. And lower motor neurons, they will innervate these muscles in the body to actually produce movement in the limbs. So this shows us a cross section of the spinal cord. So we've got the dorsal root and the ventral root. And both of these roots of the spinal cord, they carry different types of information that are important for movement. So the fibers entering the dorsal part of the spinal cord, they bring in information from the sensory receptors in the body. So all those receptors that we talked about in chapter 8 when we were talking about the organization of sensory systems. So this is where the dorsal root is getting that information from. It's getting it from those sensory receptors in the body. So these fibers converge as they enter the spinal cord, and they form a collection of fibers that are referred to as the dorsal root. So then we've got fibers leaving the ventral part of the spinal cord. So the fibers leaving the ventral part of the spinal cord will be carrying information from the spinal cord down to the muscles. And these also form another kind of collection of strands, collection of fibers that are known as the ventral root. So this is the ventral root. This is the dorsal root bringing in sensory information, and the ventral root bringing those motor signals down from the brain, out through the spinal cord, and then out through the body. So in the spinal cord itself, the outer part of the spinal cord, it consists of white matter or tracts of white matter. Oh, sorry. Saying that in reverse. So inner spine is made up of the cell bodies. So if we look here, it even looks gray. So gray matter here, the inner part of the spinal cord. So that's going to be made up of cell bodies, because remember, gray matter is comprised of cell bodies, whereas white matter is comprised of axons, those myelinated axons. So the inner part of the spine, made up of gray matter, made up of cell bodies, and the outer part of the spine is made up of white matter, which are those myelinated axons, which are carrying information to and from the brain. So all of that is the corticospinal tract. And then we've got a second tract pathway for motor control, which is called the corticobulbar tract. So most of the muscles in the body are controlled directly by the brain. So these passing through the spinal cord. So these bypass. So okay, corticospinal tract carrying information through the brainstem and to the spinal cord. But we've got this other tract that controls muscles that are directly controlled by the brain. So without that kind of middleman of the spinal cord. So this is the corticobulbar tract. So this is a tract that carries information from the cortex down to the cranial nerves that control the neck and the face, including eye movements. So this tract bypasses the spinal cord. So these cranial nerves that are controlled by the corticobulbar tract, they are essential for critical reflexes associated with breathing, eating, eye movements, facial expressions. So with the cortical and these are controlled by the brainstem directly. So with the corticobulbar tract, again, missing out, not relying on that middleman of the spinal cord, right? So these tracts run through the brainstem. So these neurons in the corticobulbar tract will have their cell bodies originating in the cortex, but their axons are sent through the brainstem to the muscles of the face and neck without passing through the spinal cord. So this system is responsible for eye movements, face movements, smiling, squinting, etc. So like the corticospinal tract, the corticobulbar tract does also cross over at the medulla, but doesn't pass through the spinal cord. So the key thing with these two tracts is that one passes through the spine and one does not. Both systems do have their cell bodies in the cortex with axons sent through the brainstem, and both systems do cross over at the medulla, but the corticospinal tract passes through the spine, the corticobulbar tract does not. So the corticobulbar tract does receive input from both cortical and subcortical structures, including the basal ganglia. So many nuclei in the brainstem, including the vestibular nuclei, including reticular formation, the substantia nigra, all these regions send direct projections down the spinal cord. These motor pathways, these are part of the corticospinal tract, meaning that they're not part of this corticobulbar tract. So these projections through the vestibular nuclei, reticular formation, and substantia nigra, these allow some indirect control of posture and maintaining muscle tone through the input that are received from subcortical and cortical structures. So while the corticospinal tract doesn't pass, while the corticobulbar tract doesn't pass through the spine directly, it does influence the body in terms of maintaining posture and muscle tone through these projections that run through like the vestibular nuclei, the reticular formation, and the substantia nigra. So indirect control of posture and muscle tone. Okay, so let's look at how the brain controls muscles. neural control of muscles. So what are muscles? Well, muscles are fibers. They are long fibers, thin cells that usually run the length of the muscle itself. So muscle fibers contain receptor sites for acetylcholine. This is the primary neurotransmitter that is involved in moving muscles. And action potentials are produced come in the form of single contractions or twitches of the muscles. So the contraction of skeletal muscles is directly controlled by motor neurons that originate in spinal cord or in those cranial nerves in the brainstem. So skeletal muscles are not evenly distributed throughout the body. So that also means that motor neurons are not evenly distributed throughout the body either. So some parts of our body have more muscle than others. And this also translates over into, how much of parts of the spinal cord are dedicated to different body parts. So the ventral horn, for example, it's larger in areas that are devoted to muscles in the arms and legs. So, and basically, if we look at this, so the ventral horn area that's associated with here, compared to here, the enlargement of the ventral horns in these areas is due to the greater number of motor neurons that are required to innervate the muscles of the arms and legs. That's kind of important in terms of, how much space is devoted to the spinal cord. Depends on how, the amount of muscle and if there's more muscle, there's going to be a greater number of motor neurons. So the spinal motor neurons that are directly responsible for contracting muscles in the body are known as alpha motor neurons. So alpha motor neurons, these are large myelinated neurons that are capable of really rapid signals. So muscles, they're activated by the motor neurons, which are the final neural elements of the motor system before the movement is produced. So alpha motor neurons, they innervate muscle fibers and produce contractions of those fibers. So motor neuron axons, they branch into many different terminals near the target muscle. So that's what is being shown in this picture here. So the red stripes in this picture, these are muscles, and the black parts here are the axon terminals synapsing onto the muscles. So alpha motor neurons, they form connections with muscle fibers at locations that are called neuromuscular junctions. So that's what these would be, the connections between here and this muscle and here and this muscle. These are neuromuscular junctions. So alpha motor neurons form these really efficient connections with these muscle fibers at neuromuscular junctions. And I say they're efficient because basically the arrival of even a single action potential in a motor neuron is capable of producing an action potential in the muscle fiber almost every single time. So almost every action potential will elicit a muscle contraction. So motor neurons are the final common pathway through which the brain and spinal cord control muscles. So as with other neurons, an action potential in a motor neuron is going to release a neurotransmitter, and like I said, for motor neurons, this neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine. So all motor neurons also are myelinated for fast transmission. So motor neurons, the axons, they branch into many different terminals near their target muscle. And this is where at those neuromuscular junctions, and this is where acetylcholine is released. So an action potential in a motor neuron is going to result in the release of acetylcholine. So when acetylcholine is released, it doesn't modify the activity of downstream neurons. So, if you think about activity and, in other types of neurons, you can have some downstream effects, right? This is a little bit different with motor neurons. So when acetylcholine is released, it doesn't really modify the activity of those downstream neurons. Instead, it makes the muscle fibers contract. So the number and frequency of the action potentials and the number of muscle fibers in a muscle will determine the force that the muscle can generate. So alpha motor neurons provide kind of a physical basis for translating nerve signals into those mechanical actions that will change the length and tension of the muscles. So motor neurons do release only acetylcholine, but they can still respond to other neurotransmitters, both excitatory and inhibitory, because these motor neurons, they could be receiving other types of input. For example, glutamate input from GABA neurons. So acetylcholine being the main one, but these motor neurons can respond to a variety of other neurotransmitters as well. So the brain receives information about limb position and movement from those mechanoreceptors that we talked about in the last Neuropod lesson, number 3 of 3 for chapter 8. So we talked about mechanoreceptors already. So these are embedded in the tissue surrounding the joints, in our case, right now when we're talking about motor control. So mechanoreceptors located in the tissue surrounding the joints, they will respond to movement of the joint. So also we've got receptors in the skin as well that supply information about movement and position of the limbs and joints. So our alpha motor neurons, they get input from 3 types of neurons in order to initiate movement. So we've got muscle spindles, we've got Golgi tendons, and we've got joints. So muscle spindles, we'll start looking at those next, but they're specialized sensors that help to form the feedback loops from the muscle fibers to the spinal cord. So we'll look at muscle spindles in a bit of detail. We've also got our Golgi tendon organs. So these provide feedback about the degree of muscle contraction or force. And we've got our joints that provide us with information about the position and movement from those mechanoreceptors in the tissue that surround our joints. So let's look a little bit more at muscle spindles. So muscle spindles, they lie parallel to the muscles. So this is a muscle spindle right here. This is a Golgi tendon down here. We'll get to that in a minute. But with the muscle spindles, if you think about if an object, say a cup of coffee, for example, if it's placed in your hand, in your outstretched hand, your hand might initially drop a bit in response to the weight of the cup before returning to its original position. So you can imagine somebody setting something heavy in your hand and it kind of goes down and then it comes back up a bit. So you compensate for that added weight in your hand by increasing the contraction in the muscles of your arms. So this kind of contraction, this kind of adjustment requires very precise feedback loops that measure how much your muscles have stretched. So you may not have thought that this is important, but it is really important that your body can, really important for your brain to know just how much your muscles have stretched for any type of movement that we're making. So the first element in this feedback loop that will tell the brain how much a muscle has been stretched is the muscle spindle. So muscle spindles, they are structures, they're embedded in the muscle, and they serve as a source of information about muscle length. So they tell the brain about muscle length. So the spindle gets its name from its shape because it does look like the spindle of a spinning wheel. So each muscle spindle contains about a dozen or so of these intrafusal muscle fibers. So fusal meaning being the Latin word for spindle, intra meaning within. So these are the inner parts. These intrafusal fibers, they're located within the spindle. So muscle fibers that are responsible for the contractions are the extrafusal muscles, or the fibers that are outside of the spindle. So that's these right here. And we've got it kind of got this blown up a bit. So muscle spindles, they lie parallel to parallel to the extrafusal fibers, so that when the muscle stretches, so do those associated spindles. So if we kind of peel this apart a little bit, this section up here apart, these muscle spindles apart, there's a little bit more going on in here. So wrapped around the middle section of each spindle fiber are very large, very fast firing axons known as primary sensory endings. So these fibers generate action potentials every time the muscle spindle stretches. Because these are sensory endings, because these sensory endings interact with all three types of muscle spindle fibers, it provides information about both the length and the velocity of the stretch. So these fibers, these primary sensory endings, they fire rapidly, they fire early during the stretch of a muscle, but they begin to fire more slowly at the end of the stretch. So when they fire early and rapidly during the initial part of the stretch, that gives an indication of length plus velocity. So the length of the movement plus the velocity of the movement. but then they start to slow their firing down more at the end of the movement, and then you're getting information about length only. So this is how these sensory endings provide information about both velocity and length. So the early part of the stretch tells us about velocity and length, and then at the end of the stretch, at the end of the movement, the contraction, we're getting information about length only. So providing information about both length and velocity. So we've also got these secondary sensory endings that terminate at the end of the spindle. Okay, so let's get our primary. So our primary sensory endings, that's the red one. The secondary ones are the green ones here. So the secondary sensory endings, they terminate at the ends of the spindle here and here, whereas these primary ones wrap right around. So the secondary sensory endings, they terminate at the end of the spindle, and they're most sensitive to kind of a static stretch and indicate length only. So the secondary sensory endings don't give information about velocity. They only give information about the length of the muscle stretch. So gamma motor neurons, that is these ones in here, these yellow ones. So the gamma motor neurons, they have, they are basically the intrafusal fibers in the intrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle have their own set of motor neurons, which are the gamma motor neurons. So gamma motor neurons alter the tension within the spindle, and they also control the sensitivity of the receptors. So gamma motor neurons, they're small spinal neurons that innervate the muscle spindles. So our alpha motor neurons, they go to the alpha motor neurons, they go to those extrafusal muscle fibers of the spindle. So you can see a lot of things going on here within this muscle spindle. So this is our alpha motor neuron going to the extrafusal, that outer part of the muscle spindle. So a little bit, I mentioned the Golgi tendon organs, but let's just say a couple more things about that before we wrap up. So the muscle spindles, they do a pretty good job of providing the brain and spinal cord with information about muscle length or the degree of stretch. But we also need to have feedback about the degree of muscle contraction or the force of the muscle contraction. So this information is provided by the Golgi tendon organs. So these are located at the junction between the muscle and the tendon. And like the muscle spindles, the Golgi tendon organs are innervated by those sensory axons, those sensory fibers. And the fibers from the Golgi tendon organs, they enter the spinal cord and form synapses with spinal interneurons. And then in turn, these interneurons can inhibit activity of the alpha motor neurons if the stretch if the muscle contraction kind of exceeds a certain point. So basically, the stimulating the Golgi tendon organs inhibits the motor neurons that are acting on those muscles, And this will relax the tension and prevent us from, contracting so much that we damage our muscles. So last point here, again, coming back to another aspect of Chapter 8, proprioception. So again, perception of body movements and our position of our body in space. This is important for coordinating movement. And again, we get proprioceptive information about the position of our body and what our body's doing from the muscle spindles and from our Golgi tendon organs. So with muscle spindles indicating, monitoring muscle length, also muscle velocity, movement velocity, and then our Golgi tendon organs monitoring the tension of our muscles. All important for determining where our body is in space. Okay, so that's it for the recorded part, and there'll be a video to follow.